Okay, let me welcome you all here today, and let me also welcome all of those who are not physically present in the room, but who are following us online. So the reason why we have gathered today is to discuss, I would say, a pretty hot topic, carbon border adjustment mechanism. Not necessarily tax, but mechanism, as the term goes. This is not really a new topic, but this is a topic that has gathered a lot of speed and a lot of interest. In a sense, this issue of whether or not countries that introduce some form of carbon taxation, whether in the form of permits or in others, whether they should accompany this policy, this domestic policy, with a external measure, has been there since the start. When the ETS system was introduced, there was quite rapidly this question: well, why are we only issuing this to domestic producers? What's happening about foreign producers? And that debate has existed in other countries that have introduced carbon taxation, who have considered introducing carbon taxation, like in the US. The US does not have, at the federal level at least, carbon taxation, but that discussion has been there for quite a while. Yes, we should introduce it in the US, and yes, we should have a system of that sort. Others have said it would have a lot of problems that would result from the introduction, all kinds of problems that we will discuss today. This is very badly adjusted. I'm struggling with this. So we are going to hear a presentation by Georg, and then comments by Gabriel. And I should say that the timing, this is really a terrible system. I should say that the timing of the event is really perfect. Apart from the corona virus, the reason why it's perfect is that yesterday the Commission launched a call for views on this subject. We all know that the reason why this subject has taken really salience is because of the European Green Deal, and the fact that already last summer Mrs. von der Leyen and then reissued in December announced that yes, the Commission is considering, as part of its European Green Deal plans, to potentially introduce a mechanism, a border carbon adjustment mechanism. What he did yesterday is call on stakeholders, including think tanks, to provide their views on different options for a carbon adjustment mechanism. And in particular, 3 options for a mechanism have been presented, but there could be others. So there is only 1 month for this consultation, and so yesterday was the very first day. So I think we are ideally placed here to have that discussion at the launch of this process. Georg, we look forward to your presentation, and then I will turn to Gabriel for comments, and then I will open the floor for discussion. Georg?
Thanks a lot, André. So can we put on the slides? So André perfectly introduced the subject. Now, why would we want to have a carbon border tax at that stage? So maybe a short kind of framing remark. So we are speaking here of a carbon border tax. Our idea is essentially all sorts of instruments that put a price on carbon imports from other places. Can be largely kind of subsumed under this wording, but we don't mean other measures like standards or other tools that might be subsumed under the idea of a mechanism. So as you can see from the title, I'm trying to be relatively provocative and line out a bit the case on why I think, and there are different views at Bruegel on that this is not the perfect way forward to put a lot of emphasis on introducing a carbon border tax. Now, why would one want to have a carbon border tax? Essentially two main reasons. One is the fear of carbon leakage. So what is carbon leakage? Carbon leakage is if we reduce emissions here in Europe, essentially somebody outside Europe is producing the same goods and exporting them to Europe, and then the emissions happen outside Europe, and potentially even more emissions because you have to include additional transportation, and maybe outside of Europe the facilities are even less efficient than our facilities. And this is essentially the main argument that you are going to hear in the legal text, because that's the basis for all WTO compliance, which we are going to speak about later. The other argument that is more inward-looking is the question of loss of competitiveness. So companies are less caring about carbon emissions; they are more caring about their competitiveness. So steel producers inside Europe will claim that they are essentially losing competitiveness, making less money here, having to close down. Carbon border taxes, as André said, have not been a new subject in member states and in Brussels. So we had in 2007 already a draft by the Commission, 2009 a French non-paper, 2016 another French non-paper just on cement. So you might ask yourself, why are we discussing that now? And I would see two main arguments here. The first is with the European Green Deal, the idea is to really increase the targets of the European Union at a dramatic speed. So what we have on paper is 50 to 55% reduction of carbon emissions in 2030 compared to 1990. That means from current levels, it's another almost 40% reduction. So think yourself that if you have 10 cars on the street that are with internal combustion engines, 4 of them will have to be different. And that's for the entire economy. So with these higher targets, the fear of carbon leakage obviously gets stronger because carbon prices might have to increase dramatically to achieve these significantly stepped up target. The other thing is that the current tools for preventing carbon leakage, the free allowances under the emission trading system, are slowly losing in importance. So over time, we have less allowances put out, and there's also less free allowances given to the industry. So industry also is looking for new tools to prevent against carbon leakage. So as André said, the Commission has put up an idea, and the two sticky words here are for selected sectors. So probably the Commission will not think about a comprehensive tool, but about a tool for selected sectors and in compliance with WTO rules. And I'll come to what that might mean a bit later. So what is carbon leakage? Maybe a bit kind of zooming out as an economist, there's different types of carbon leakage. I would argue you have essentially the direct leakage, which is you put on your industry particular regulations, and then your industry moves out of Europe because of those regulations, and that's the so-called pollution heaven hypothesis. There's another strand of literature that essentially argues if you put on your industry specific rules, they get more innovative, and therefore they develop the technologies to reduce emissions that might be even taken up outside of Europe. That's the Porter hypothesis, which goes in the other direction. At the same time, you have indirect leakage, and that's going to become important as well in a minute, which is Europe. Decarbonization strategy will rest a lot on reducing fossil fuel consumption. If you reduce fossil fuel consumption in the European Union, essentially global fossil fuel consumption will also be depressed by a bit. Then global fossil fuel prices will decrease as a result of a reduction in demand, and therefore other parts of the world will start to increase their consumption of fossil fuels because the prices are lower. So you have an indirect leakage of emissions to other parts of the world. Same might be for beef or other carbon-intensive products. So the whole idea of a carbon border tax essentially rests on the claim that there's a significant problem with carbon leakage. And in the paper that has been published some minutes ago, which you can find on the website, we essentially try to put together the literature that we could find on the evidence for carbon leakage, and our results are more mixed than what you might hear in the public. So we argue essentially that for existing carbon pricing policies, and we have some in the US, we have some in Europe, and the evidence of leakage on the aggregate level, that there's really kind of large-scale economic activity moving out of Europe because of that, or large-scale emissions moving out of Europe is very mixed. Typically, in most works, you don't find any significant results. And there are three plausible reasons for that. The first reason is, well, we are talking a lot about very capital-intensive industry, and it finds it's very difficult to kind of adjust within 1-2 years, and it takes quite a lot of time to adjust over time. So we don't see the effects quickly. Then, in existing schemes, also the carbon pricing differentials that we had were not very large. So European emission trading prices were in the order of less than 10 euros for quite a while per ton. And then the third reason is that a lot of the existing schemes also had compensations to carbon-intensive industry in order to prevent exactly that leakage that we are not observing. But we also have no kind of clear evidence for leakage so far, so it's hard to say how strong the effect is going to be. On the other hand, we have the modeling work, so people running big trade models, CGE model as well, and they find leakage, limited leakage on an aggregate level. So overall, they find that if Europe reduces emissions by 100 tons, then about 5 to 20 tons of additional emissions can be expected outside of Europe to come there. So there is some leakage. But if you then look into the models and see, what you see is that about half of this leakage is essentially due to the energy price channel. So of this 5 to 20, maybe 2 to 10 tons of increase is due to the energy price channel, which you cannot really do something about with a carbon border tax, because you cannot really change the fact that the energy prices globally are depressed due to European decarbonization action. And furthermore, these models depend strongly on underlying assumptions. I mean, they are calibrated based on empirical results, and here one of the main input variable are so-called Armington elasticities that tell you how strongly domestic consumers favor domestic products over foreign products. And if there is no strong preference for domestic products, it would mean kind of all the, you would see a lot of leakage. If there is no strong preferences, then if there is very strong preferences for domestic products, then you would not see any leakage at all. Now, if we look in the models, there's typically a point estimate put into the models, and that's then the result. If you look into the estimation of the elasticities, the error bands are huge. So essentially, what you see coming out of the models is largely based on how you calibrate them, and that's very uncertain. Now, if you look into individual sectors, like what we call the carbon-intensive and trade-exposed sectors, like aluminium, cement, steel, there the empirical literature tends to find some limited leakage, even so the range of estimates varies widely, and the effect is still not huge. So you have some effect, but it's not like the entire industry is going to disappear due to carbon leakage. Because many other factors matter for the location of companies. As I said, it's typically highly capital-intensive installations. They will be there. They are introduced in value chains, their transportation cost, non-tariff cost, geographic factors, the availability of other factors. So overall, there's a lot of reasons for why a company is sitting in one place, and the price of carbon will be only one of many elements. There's some empirical work in the US done on the elasticity to energy prices, essentially saying that, yes, if you put a price on additional taxes on energy, essentially production will go down domestically, but imports won't increase much. And as we were not really able to find kind of a historic example of how strong emission price differentials translate into a dislocation of industry, because there aren't strong emission price differentials in the past. We looked into energy price differentials as a proxy, and the example that we come up with here is in the US. You have very different natural gas prices within one country. In Texas, the price of natural gas dropped from about the same level as in California to about half of the level that we see in California. So therefore, you would expect that a very natural gas intensive industry like hydrogen production, that is essentially using natural gas as its main input, would very quickly adjust to go to the place where natural gas prices are significantly lower. If you see the timeline here of that, what we see is essentially relatively little effect in terms of the production volumes of hydrogen.
Can you explain a little bit this chart?
Sure. So the red line is essentially the price ratio between the prices in California and Texas. So it started at about parity at 0.9 in 2008. The price for natural gas in say Texas and California were about the same, and in 2018 they were at about 0.5, which means that the price in California was twice as high than in Texas. Then the bars are essentially the use of natural gas in hydrogen production, which the US reports for those two areas. And what you essentially see is that the use of natural gas in hydrogen production has been relatively moving in the same way between California and Texas over this time, even so the price differential between the two areas has been massive. And probably that's because California is a big market, because there's so many reasons why you would want to have your hydrogen being produced in California and not in Texas. But it shows that it's very unlikely to assume that if we have high carbon price differentials, that essentially 100% of our steel industry will disappear from one moment to the next. So the argument is that even a perfect carbon border tax will only address a relatively limited problem. At the aggregate level, we have fairly insignificant leakage rates, and around half of those leakage rates might be due to indirect leakage, which cannot really be addressed by carbon border taxes. And then the leakage that we observe is highly concentrated in a few carbon-intensive sectors. A bit from the economist ivory tower, you could argue that those sectors are also having relatively low employment and relatively low value added. So for the kind of overall value generation in a continent, they might not be the most important ones. And even within these sectors, leakage is limited, as I tried to show. Now on the side of the much pain, so kind of what would a carbon border tax cause in terms of problems? I'm not sure how I'm with timing.
You have 7-8 minutes.
7-8 minutes. Okay, I think I jump slightly forward on the to just go through those points. The rest is in the so kind of the detailed work is in the paper. So I would argue that if you have to take into account all the difficulties of implementation in legal terms of the of a carbon border tax, so making it essentially WTO compliant, making it UNFCCC compliant. You have to take into account your domestic constraints with having very different countries with very different industries and different interests, and your foreign constraints, especially the risk of retaliation and the risk of not upsetting developing countries. You most likely end up with a carbon border adjustment mechanism that is far from the economically perfect way of doing that. And so the effectiveness of the tool will most likely be not most likely far from perfect. At the same time, you'll get several trade deviations in the process. On the one hand, if you introduce, for example, a selected mechanism, because as the Commission is proposing, there will be a selected mechanism, you might essentially have the problem of cascading protectionism. So we have seen, for example, the US implementing a tariff on steel and aluminium imports in order to protect their industry. And the result of that has been that indeed the imports of steel and aluminium to the US went down. At the same time, the domestic production of steel and aluminium in the US did not increase. So what happened is that essentially the US started to import significantly more wires and pins and nails and other aluminium and steel products. So you might end into a problem where you try to protect against the leakage in a low value product and go and essentially see then a leakage in a higher value product, which is certainly something that then other industries will not find amusing in Brussels. You might also see other trade deviations. For example, if you have a complete system of carbon border protection where essentially the entire value chain is taken into account, you might see trade deviations that essentially the cleanest companies around the world are then selling to Europe, which have before sold to their domestic markets. So think of a steel producer in Georgia that currently produces for the local market based on hydropower or whatever other example you want to take. That's then not selling for the Georgian market anymore. That's then going to sell to the European market and not facing a carbon border tax, while then the Georgian market will be supplied by Ukrainian steel, which is very dirty. So in that sense, it's quite difficult to find an effective way that does not produce those trade deviations. If you want to have a complete value chain recognition in this thing, the cost of implementation will be huge. So you have to track down the entire value chains, and I hope we can have a discussion on how that's going to be possible. And also on the political side, I mean, if you want to do that, you need to essentially go out now to speak to all our trade partners. Our foreign services will be occupied with that. The Commission will be occupied with that. So there is a lot of political and human cost in introducing that. And finally, and I think that's for me the most severe argument, I would argue that at the end of the day, when we have this thing ready and when we have to decide to implement it, there's a risk of possible retaliation. So if we go ahead with that, then our trade partners, and especially the bigger ones like the US, will say, no, we are not going to accept that. We think you are trying to push on us your domestic climate agenda. We are not happy about that. And therefore, we are not buying Airbus planes anymore. We are not doing X, Y, and Z. And then the question is, can a union of 27 member states with very different interests in this thing hold together and essentially stand through such a fight, or is there a big risk that the thing will fall apart? My before last slide, I would argue for an alternative mechanism. And I would argue that under an adjustment mechanism, you can not only understand protective instruments, but you can also understand kind of progressive instruments. And the adjustment mechanism that we are thinking of is essentially supporting low carbon production. So the idea is that yes, we have our current industry and it's dirty and it's going to decline over time. We are not going to invest in dirty anymore because anyway by 2050 we shouldn't have dirty anymore in the system. But we support heavily the introduction of clean. So European policy should take the money from the free allowances, take maybe also money from the remaining ETS, and put it on supporting low carbon technology deployment in big time, so that we are essentially the continent that develops green steel, green cement, green aluminium, which, as it kind of buys our way down the learning curve, can then later on also be implemented globally. And that's then, again, the Porter hypothesis, that we are essentially, with our carbon regulation, helping globally to decarbonize. So I think I would leave it at that.
Yeah. No, please. Please give
so,
your last slide. I mean, what is...
I mean, the conclusion is essentially we see relatively little gain because the leakage literature to us is not that convincing, and we think we should look into what's going to happen in reality and potentially adjust. We think it might make sense for the Commission to work in parallel on CBT as a deterrent, to make sure that countries outside Europe see that there is a risk that if they don't move in the right direction, something will come. But we should domestically not count that this thing is going to be implemented. So we should not kind of highlight to our industry, you will get this thing in 2 years, because it might eventually not work, and we need to get this done with climate policy. Otherwise, we are in big trouble. And as a complementary mechanism, I'm calling for significant support for clean alternatives. Thank you.
Very clear. Thank you. Thank you very much, Georg. So, little gain, high cost. I turn to you. Gabriel, you are professor of economics at the University of Kiel. You are the president of the World Economic Institute there. You have done a lot of work, like Georg. This is a field, as I said at the start, that has not waited for the announcement last summer for people to research this, because indeed this is a real economic question. And I think Georg put it very well. There are gains and there are losses. And I think we all agree on the gains and losses. I think where the discussion is what is the relative weight on the gains and costs. So what is your take?
And that's exactly what we economists should be good at, no? In weighing those trade-offs. So I think I disagree with a couple of things that Georg said. So first of all, how empirically relevant is the leakage problem? If we look back into the experience with the ETS, it's not surprising that we don't find much evidence. Georg has said why. Well, because those prices historically were low most of the time. But what is even more important, I think, in the empirical assessment is that while prices have been low, Europe and many European member states have enacted other regulation with the aim of reducing carbon emissions. I think about the car industry and the fleet standards and so on. So there has been regulation, and the regulation might not come with a very specific carbon price, but it still imposes costs on the industries. And so if we, rather than look just for the effect of the ETS price, which has been very low for many years, but look at the broader index of, or broader indicator of climate policy, then the literature is a little bit, has an easier way to find evidence for leakage. I, of course, have my own shares in this because I've published some of my nicer papers there. And the message is that we do find limited leakage once we move away from carbon prices to more comprehensive indicators of climate policy. And the second point that is important, I think, with respect to the ex post assessment of climate policies is that they are not very informative about what is going to come. Because if the average ETS price over the last decades has been, or years has been maybe 10 euros, we're now talking about ETS prices that are 3-digit. You know, they have to be ramped up dramatically. And we know from all sorts of economic models, intuitions, calculations, that the impact of CO2 prices on leakage or on locational choices will be highly nonlinear. So we cannot simply say, because a price of 10 euros had no effect, a price of 100 euros will have no effect neither. No, that would be a fatal conclusion. But rather, I would say, first of all, we have evidence for leakage. It's small. And we know from other exercises that when we double efforts, leakage, the leakage likelihood would not just double, but it would quadruple. And we would need to step out our efforts, not just by some amount, but dramatically, and the leakage will be increasing over proportionately. So we should, I think, know that. And for that reason, I think we need some sort of carbon border mechanism, or we cannot have high CO2 prices. I think that's the choice. And that's why, for political economy reasons, I think we need to have these arguments there. And that's the reason why von der Leyen, Macron, and many others, also I think the US Senate and House of Representatives, when they produced their draft bills, they have insisted on this because it's needed to get high prices passed in the laws. The CGE literature also points towards leakage. It's correct that there are a lot of uncertainties, but it's actually not parameter uncertainty. If you dig into this, so I have my own interests, of course, there. I've worked in this, but across studies, if you look at the literature, that comprises now hundreds of papers. If you look, then you find that there is variance, of course. It depends a lot on different assumptions, whether you have direct leakage or also indirect leakage or both of it, and many other things. So it's scenario driven. But across those many studies, we do have relatively robust evidence that there is leakage, around 15% or something like that. No? You can say, okay, 15% is not big, but the prices usually put into the CGE model, so that's why I talk about scenarios, are prices that we thought are reasonable in the last 10, 15 years. So there are many studies who have implemented something like 25 euros a ton, maybe 50, but the 100 or 130 that we need are not implemented, and they would drive up leakage rates dramatically. Again, it's in the square. They would increase in the square, and so we should take this serious. There's another reason why we should think about carbon border adjustment, and that's the following. The EU has about 10% of global emissions if we look at territorial emissions. So the stuff that goes through European chimneys, through the bellies of European cows and so on. So it's about 10% of global emissions. But the carbon footprint caused by Europeans, by our consumption essentially, is about 12% of global emissions. So if we extend the carbon pricing scheme beyond the pricing of production to the pricing of consumption, and that's essentially what a good designed carbon border adjustment does, then we increase the reach of our own climate policy by 20%, by a fifth. And that increases the effectiveness of this action quite substantially. Now, of course, we are still not talking about a large share of global emissions. It's 12% of global emissions, still small, but it's bigger, and it would probably lead to something that the literature calls negative leakage, right? If we have a CBA, a carbon border adjustment in place, and we tax the carbon footprint instead of carbon emissions, then we add incentives abroad to save on emissions, because that would make it easier to sell to the European market. We would, in an ideal mechanism, exempt exporters, domestic exporters. There are good reasons to do that. We can discuss that. And that, of course, reduces incentives for our exporters to save on emissions, but because Europe is the world's largest CO2 importer, so CO2 embodied in goods. No? We're the largest CO2 importer in the world, and that means the incentives that we put on others are worth more than the incentives that we lose at home by such a CBA, and that's why the effectiveness and also the efficiency of the system goes up. Why is it better to tax the footprint or to price the footprint instead of production? For a super simple reason that tax experts have been putting forward in many other areas as well, is you'd rather tax the immobile tax base. Carbon consumption is done by us, by consumers, by the Europeans. We don't move around. We don't move to Siberia because gas is cheap and heat our houses there. No. So the consumption doesn't move around. and we tax an immobile or price immobile base, that's much more efficient than pricing a mobile base. And as production is mobile, that's not such a good idea. Now, many of the concerns that Georg put forward are very real concerns. So he's totally right. There is an issue of protectionist abuse potentially by Europeans. There is an issue of potential retaliation. And most important for me is that we might create a bureaucratic monster. No, I think this is very serious and needs to be taken into account. And that's why I like the following idea. It's an output-based allocation mechanism with a tax, no? Ober cum tax. That's one way to put it. What would that be? So first of all, let's recognize that we already have a carbon border adjustment in Europe, which is the fact that we give free allowances to carbon-intensive and trade-intensive industries. And why do we do that? That's to help them maintain their competitiveness on international markets. So when the ETS was invented, carbon leakage was addressed by these free allowances. What if we continue those free allowances and maybe even extend them, give those certificates away for free? That would free production from the carbon price, and instead of putting the carbon price on production, we tax the goods that those industries that receive free allowances produce, and tax those goods regardless of whether they originate in Europe or originate abroad. So there would be, let's say, a steel tax, a cement tax, taxes on chemicals that would possibly be proportional to the carbon content of those goods. We don't need to have all the details. We would see, well, there is an extra tax on steel and so on and so forth for whatever the origin of those goods is, but production would be exempted. Now, one can put up such a scheme and calibrate it, very carefully, and hire a team of economists and calibrate that so that it, reproduces the perfect carbon border adjustment setup that I described before, which is like a value-added setup. No? The perfect system would be one that is like the value-added scheme where we impose imports to the domestic taxation, and we exempt exports, like with value-added tax. But the tax base is something that we don't really know. No? It's the carbon content of goods, of imports and of exports. And if we do the Ober cum tax model very carefully and choose the taxes correctly and give the right amounts of free allowances and so on, so if we calibrate that in the right way, we can reproduce the ideal carbon border adjustment setup. Now that's theoretically very attractive. And it's even more attractive because free allowances, which one could call export subsidies under certain conditions, never have been challenged. No? So there is no case before the WTO that says that giving free allowances to the European steel industry is a subsidy or is a problem, right? And having taxes that differ across goods is not a WTO problematic issue neither. So we have a tax on sparkling wine and on schnapps and on beer and so what? No? So we can have taxes on steel and aluminium and chemical products and so on according to their average carbon contents. And I think that would not be subject to the retaliation fear. It would not be subject so much to problems with the WTO, and we can go very far in making the system as good as an ideal carbon border adjustment system would be. So how far would we go? Well, as an economist, we would, of course, balance, as we always do, marginal benefits and marginal costs. So making this Ober cum tax system very close to the ideal would be expensive because we would need a lot of information. And so we'd probably not push it that far, but we can go relatively far, and keep the bureaucratic and red tape in bay. So I'm more in favor of going about that, and the key motivation I think for me is to say we need to put this system in place in order to have the high CO2 prices that we need in order to make innovation and so on worthwhile. I think that's the last argument. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gabriel. So we have Georg's view and Gabriel's view. What I find interesting, unusual for me as an economist who has participated in many debates on this issue is that typically in such debate you have the environmental economists who is pushing for this very, very much in the name of, climate, and, there's a climate emergency, and, okay, there may be some trade issue that comes, but it's the price worth paying. And then you have the trade economists who are saying, hey, wait a second. Yes, there is a climate emergency, but to look at the world trading system is already in a weak situation. Are you sure that, yes, maybe it's WTO-compatible, but nonetheless, there are some countries that would not play along. There would be retaliation nonetheless, and therefore, you are putting at risk the trading system. That's usually the kind of thing that I hear, sort of trade economists sort of being reluctant and the environmental economists being very much in favor. Here, I think what is novel in a sense in the debate that we are having this afternoon is that we have slightly opposite argument. Now, let me just, apart from what I just said, let me just add one point. I'm not here to be the judge and to say I agree or disagree with one or the other. I think we will leave the audience to play that role and to give their comments, and there are issues of legal matters indeed, WTO, also EU, because one slips sometime, one talks about a tax, is it a mechanism, exactly what it is, how would it be actually implemented, and what are indeed the legal implications, both within the EU and at the international level. But I think that I want to push the both of you a bit further on one dimension. So part of the discussion that we had was, in a sense, about the evaluation of how much leakage there is. Okay, that's one issue, and as normal among economists, two economists, three views. That is normal, and one should have the debate, and everybody brings their own element. And I think again, I will leave the audience to bring their views or their comments on this. I'm not going to say anything about this. Is there a lot or is there not a lot of leakage, and therefore is there, yes or no, potentially a need or justification for this? And then one can say, okay, assuming one does, then the consequences. Maybe yes, maybe there is leakage. Okay, which you sort of downplay, but yes, maybe there is leakage, but maybe the solution is worse than the problem. That is always obvious because of the other dimensions. That is certainly there. The first question that I would like to put to you before opening to the audience is the following. Both of you have recalled this number. That is obviously an important number to keep in mind. The EU is responsible roughly for 10% of emissions in terms of production, and as you indicated, Gabriel, and that's a very important point, we are responsible for a larger number, 20% more, if we look in terms of consumption, okay, which I think is indeed the correct way to look at this. But 20% more than 10 is a lot from an EU perspective, but still from a global perspective, 10 or 12 Absolutely. Is not hugely different. So, in other words, I think we are facing a global issue, right? Climate change is not a European problem, it's a problem for humanity, of which we are a part. And therefore, one can agree that ultimately what we want, having signed up to the Paris Agreement, we want that the world, we can control ourselves what we do, right? We can take initiatives, but we know that those initiatives are not enough. I'm not arguing to say, well, since nobody else is doing anything, we should not do it. That's not the way I'm taking this, but I'm saying everybody needs to move, right? And all of those who have signed up, so far everybody signed up, the US has not left at the moment the Paris Agreement. We want indeed that countries take seriously their commitment, right? And so the way I personally look at the issue of the border carbon adjustment is, what contribution, positive or negative, do we think that this is making to, not just to our own efforts, because indeed we view this as a complement, right? We are saying, no, we are moving to a higher speed. We had sort of low, the emission trading scheme at relatively low prices. Now we want to include more products, and we want to be the price equivalent to be much higher. So, we are committed to make much bigger effort, but we know that our commitment has to be also accompanied by commitment by others. And others are taking, obviously, they're not necessarily waiting for us. There are many countries that have equally ambitious, sometimes even more ambitious commitment than we have. So the one question that I would like to hear from both of you, and you have given a lot of elements, is what is your view? Let's assume that, and you can have each of you your view on leakage. Leakage is low or leakage is high. Okay, you're not in agreement about the leakage. Okay, that's an element. But then after that, what is your view as to whether this will be a contribution? One can say yes, by example or by a little bit sort of forcing other countries. We are big, and therefore what we do will have an impact on others. We are, you can take either a moral stance, we are showing the way, and others will see the light, or you can say we are big, and therefore what we are doing will force other countries. But that, it seems to me, ultimately, that is the way that I personally would judge this initiative. I understand the political economy. Obviously, the political economy, that is, are you able to implement an ambitious measure domestically if you don't do that? That's one element, okay? That's the political economy argument, okay? But then, that is still not enough. Okay, now you have implemented, you have solved your political economy problem. You have told those guys that, don't worry, I have a mechanism to compensate you, in a sense. You are not going to suffer, everybody will be there will be a level playing field here, okay? And you have solved a big hurdle, a domestic hurdle, okay? So now, yes, Europe is implementing an ambitious set of measures, domestic and external. But we still know this is not enough because we are 10 or 12% of the global emissions. So the real question, what's happening on the other 88 or 90%? So that's where I want to take you. What is it each of you think would happen? Would it contribute? Why it would contribute? Or why do you think in the end, no, it will harm this meeting together the goal of the Paris Agreement? Georg, I start with you.
Excellent question. Because that's kind of the essence of how we are able to globally decarbonize or not. So are we going to get the 88% in line with us? Because we have to remind ourselves that Paris Agreement is about full decarbonization by the second half of the century. And so everybody has to move. My argument would be that kind of with a sort of protectionist or policy that can be viewed as protectionist in the political setting, it will be very difficult in negotiations with developing countries. They will point to the UNFCCC and say, it's about differentiated responsibility. Why are you kind of wanting from us that we do the same thing as you are doing? And might not like to see that. And also, kind of countries that are very proud of their superpower status might be very worried about us trying to push them to do something that they are not kind of domestically ready to do. And only the point of being pushed is for them a problem, not so much the matter on its own. I think we had this blog post on aviation at some in the past, and one of the big sticking points in my view at the time was that it was about sovereignty, that countries don't want to be pushed around from other countries to implement things. My take is that we have an example from the past that worked extremely well. We had in Europe introduced support systems for renewables, and they were extremely costly, and you can discuss a lot about how well they were designed. They were not well designed, and we can do much better. But they had one effect, that essentially the cost of solar panels decreased by about 90% or more than 90%. And at the same time, the cost of wind also decreased substantially, maybe 80% or so, over 10, 15 years. And when this was achieved, essentially we came together in Paris, and other countries outside of the European Union were willing to sign this agreement because they saw an opportunity to meet essentially higher targets, because there was then this technology available. So you could argue that the German and Danish ratepayers to some degree also bought the Paris Agreement by developing the technology that enabled others to pursue a greener path. Now the question is, can we do that with other sectors as well? And I would argue, yes, we can do that. And essentially, it's the only sensible policy, because that's something where Europe is strong at. We are rich in capital. We have good institutions. We have good intellectual property rights protection. We have a relatively innovative and modern industry that is able to develop those technologies. And if we are able to have them, then the global rollout becomes possible. And therefore, I see the if we have to decide where we put our financial and political capital, I would rather put it on that side of the balance sheet than on the other side of the balance sheet.
Thank you, Georg. Gabriel?
Yeah, Andre, you're absolutely right. The central question is really how we can achieve the first best, which would be a global carbon price. And what we are doing with the carbon border adjustment is, to deal with the second best nature of what's going on. That only a subset of countries have CO2 prices, and then the mechanism is likely to be not second best, but third and fourth and fifth best. No, so getting more countries into the system is super important, more important than anything else. The good news is that it's not just about 88% that's not covered, but I think there are other countries, regions, Canada and so on, that do have CO2 prices. So 3/4 of global emissions are covered already or will be covered soon. We have states in the United States that do have carbon pricing. China is doing it in cities or in regions and might do it nationally. So I think any CBA, any carbon border adjustment system that the EU puts forward needs to be linked to other countries' carbon policies. No, I think so climate policy is super important to achieve that. I'm very happy about how the democratic race is going. It might well be that next year already, we might have a very different situation in the White House, and maybe a president that is, continuing Obama's carbon pricing ambitions, which were there, and then we would not talk about 12% of global carbon emissions, but about something much larger if we can do it together with the United States and potentially even include China. On technology, so. When we talk about a carbon border adjustment, we talk about the CO2 price. And economists think, most I think, agreed to that we need to internalize the cost of pollution. No? And that means a carbon price. Almost all, in Germany there are some exceptions, but almost all serious economists would say this cannot be the only tool. We also need to subsidize R&D. No? Because there are two externalities that are not internalized, and we need to do that massively. And that has the potential that it achieves more globally than creating a European carbon fortress. No? Simply because we need to convince those who own fossil fuels, gas or oil or coal, to keep the stuff in the ground. And the only way to convince them is to provide the world with technology that produces energy cheaper than burning gas, coal, or oil. No? And that must be the ambition, because that's the only way to make sure that the carbon industry goes out of business. And then indirect leakage, which is the bigger of the issue of the two, gets addressed as well. Now, how to do that is maybe to use the proceedings more directly from our carbon pricing system. So if carbon prices go to 3 digits, there will be a lot of money on the table. And the other thing I think we should be doing whenever we tax foreign producers in the carbon border adjustment, and across the, at the 25 euros that we are now having as CO2 price, we're talking about something like 20 billion euros of tax receipts or of income in Europe. We should not run a carbon border adjustment mechanism to gap the holes that the Brexit brings, but we should give it back. No? We should give back this money to the developing countries, or to even the United States, or at least put it into a fund and say, this money is used abroad in those, in those countries whose exports we tax, and is used there to incentivize maybe R&D or something like that. So I think much of it is a question of design and of diplomatical skill, to achieve both aims. Go ahead in Europe without losing our industrial basis, at the same time convince as many as possible to engage in carbon pricing themselves.
Thank you. I think you have both very well answered my question. Let's open the floor for discussion, please. Do we need a microphone?
It's coming.
Okay. If you just wait 1 second for the microphone, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Bertrand de Kromberg, Policy Planning Staff of Foreign Ministry of Belgium. Thank you very much for 2 outstanding speeches and exposés. I do notice that there is an agreement on one point, is that a tariff-like border tax would not be practical. I mean, for both speakers, I think it would be cumbersome, create a bureaucratic monster, or not be efficient. So, my question is the following. How do you ensure with a value-added type of mechanism to introduce a non-discriminatory consumption tax on products that have a high carbon content in the production process? How do you calibrate the tax in order to punish more those that produce with a high level of emission and those that to actually produce with a lower level of emission? Because you're basically going to tax all products the same. What do you take into account as production process for it? And how do you relate this to the third countries where the production process is very polluting and other countries where it is much less polluting?
Let's take a few questions. David, are you? Yeah.
David Kleiman from SAIS Johns Hopkins. Just a comment perhaps on the legal side of things. I've sort of frequently been somewhat stunned by the fact that people are asking for WTO compatibility, and this might be a challenge in fact, whereas sort of a border tax adjustment under WTO law is explicitly allowed for under Article 2. Then the question is it discriminatory vis-a-vis foreign producers, national treatment, or whether it is discriminatory among foreign producers depending on origin, for MFN. But even if that was the case, we can still provide sort of legal shelter via the exceptions of Article 20B and Article 20G. The one thing that I think would be really problematic seems to be sort of really making this tax or this adjustment contingent on the policy rather than the carbon footprint of a foreign country, meaning that under Article 20 it would be hard or difficult to justify sort of a policy-based discrimination in the sense of, is a country does a country sign up to the Paris Agreement or not? So this is a sort of a line that in the sand where one should be particularly careful that shouldn't be crossed. But other than that, WTO compatibility, there doesn't seem to be a massive problem. The other brief point that I wanted to mention is really what perhaps has been discussed much more in Brussels and is much more of an issue is the question of EU law in terms of unanimity requirements, and that debate it very much depends on whether we are looking at a tax or a regulation. If we sort of introduce a carbon tax, obviously we have to go through Article 192.2, which sort of requires unanimity for fiscal provisions. Hence, we have a special legislative procedure where the European Parliament is not involved. I'm not sure exactly how much the European Parliament views these kind of special legislative procedures these days, largely undemocratic, problematic in that respect. But sort of you have a democracy problem there, and you also have a unanimity problem in the Council. The Commission has been advocating the use of the passerelle clause in order to circumvent the problem of unanimity, where the Council would make available the OLP to the adoption of this carbon tax. Much less problematic, if I may just say very briefly, would be the extension of the ETS to importers if the judgment of the European Court of Justice still upholds, whereas it says that there's the ETS is not a tax but a regulation, and that is a question that needs to be looked at in perhaps more detail. But if that was the case, then we can go through the OLP and have no unanimity requirement but qualified majority, the involvement of the European Parliament. And so, that there are the challenges of EU law, perhaps, that one needs to look at, just sort of to complement the previous debate. Thanks.
So just to add a point before again going to further question, just on that, it'd be good to recall what was said yesterday in the document issued by the Commission, inviting for contributions by stakeholders, as they say, by citizens and stakeholders in the coming month. So the views that are being requested concern three options, essentially. One is the one that you just laid out, sort of an extension of the ETS to imports. And as you said, this is not a tax, okay? But they also, as a second option, there was also a tax. Concretely, they use the term a carbon tax on selected products, both domestically produced and imported, and then the third one is indeed an import duty, a new carbon customs duty or tax on imports. So, in other words, the full range of instruments, requiring obviously different legal basis in the Union. But at the moment, the Commission is not excluding anything. Nothing is off the table at the moment, even though, as you just recalled, each of those options has different implications for unanimity, for the role of Parliament, etc., etc. But so far, they say everything is potentially possible, and the view is that we have another year. The Commission would put forward a proposal by June of next year. So by June of next year. So this is the time frame, right? So there's going to be consultation. So now is indeed the time when this whole debate is really starting in earnest. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Eckhard von Unger. I work with the Federation of German Industries here in the Brussels office on trade issues. The sectors that are, in the debate currently in the context of carbon border adjustments are very capital intensive. The investors look at very long time periods. I would like to ask the two speakers on how their options would, go hand in hand with their need to have a kind of stability. They had to calculate prices, but I mean, with carbon border adjustment, they can vary. And with supporting them, I mean, are there limits what our competition framework can do? So far, I think this was also the case with photovoltaic. There was some incentives over a certain period of time, decreasing. But if we talk about a very long time horizon to achieve our targets, so is there anything that we have to do in your model of support, also in terms of competition policy? Do we have to adapt in this regard to be able to support these sectors over this long period of time? Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Paula Tamma. I'm a reporter with Politico Europe, and my question will be for Dr. Faber-Meyer. About taxing products based on their average carbon content, I see two orders of potential issues there. If you don't tax production but consumption, don't you lose the very incentive of a tax on carbon, therefore to impulse the industrial processes to decarbonize? And the other issue is, you mentioned free allowances could be maintained or even enlarged. Mm-hmm. And so far, with following the Commission and what they say on this issue, is that this is not the way they want to go, because if you see free allowances and indirect compensation as the policies which so far have addressed risks of carbon leakage, and then on top of that you add a tax, either whether that's domestic and on imports, that could be considered and challenged as a double form of protection, which is one of the preconditions of the WTO. So these two orders of problems. One is the very nature of leaving production alone doesn't undermine the very objective of such a measure. And the second is the legal part, even though maybe there's the lawyers. Thanks.
Thanks. Yes, so we take those two comments.
Hi, Nicolas Potier from Bruegel. My question is basically relating to the very practicality. So the cost of compliance would be huge, I assume, no? Because you would have to know, if you don't go by this kind of, as is the question before me, just ask, if you don't just go by an average price, you have to know for every single product, what is the carbon content? And for me, it sounds very difficult to implement that, in especially in developing countries. We've seen this with the garment industries, where there was huge pressure to increase labor regulations, and basically the outline of this, I think the outcome was basically zero, because most companies don't know where their garments come from. The supply chains are very long, are very complicated, and for actually to calculate the real carbon content of products should be very difficult. So then we end up with very specific products with the problems that Georg mentioned before, that we will have this kind of, we will substitute production of low value added imports to higher value added imports.
And a last comment here for this round in the middle. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Leon Tippmann from the Council of the European Union, and I would like to go back to the question of how we can convince resource-rich countries to leave the fossil fuels in the ground. And last year I did some work on a paper by Harsted from 2012, who's proposed to set up a compensation scheme where fossil fuel deposit would actually be traded, and that climate-friendly countries could compensate polluting countries for not using their fossil fuels. And I would just like to hear your views on this.
Gabriel, we start with you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So many questions, excellent questions. And I think at least the first by you on how to take into account the fact that the different companies in different countries produce with different technologies or have different carbon contents of their outputs. This also relates to your question. So ideally, if we had, perfect information and we could set up the ideal instrument, we would tax imports at exactly the carbon content that they have. We need to control the entire production chain, of course, but and we would exempt exports. That would shift taxation from production to consumption entirely. The advantage of doing that would be getting incentives right. That's exactly this. And if we cannot do that because of legal complications, because it's too complicated, and we move to a different system, then this different system is likely to be much less effective in terms of getting the incentives right, in terms of reducing the leakage problem. So we will be not in the second best, but then in the third and fourth and fifth best world. So I have not yet given up, to be frank, and I think we can be ambitious in Europe. Let's for one time, get those problems that are real, on red tape and so on, take them as a challenge and try what we can and come up with an innovative system. And there are good ideas around, no? Joe Shapiro in Stanford, for example, has a nice idea of how, to set up a mechanism that incentivizes foreign producers to truthfully reveal the carbon content of their production, right? So there are ideas around. I have a member of my institute of our Friends Society, a big entrepreneur. He says his clients want to know the carbon footprint of the products that he's selling, and the guy is having a big retail shop, and he says he wants to be able to tell his consumers whether those sneakers, what's the carbon content of these sneakers compared to those sneakers, right? So there's a lot of private sector interest in tracking down the value chains and finding out about the carbon content. There is big financial sector interest. There's the carbon disclosure project. Many of the biggest European companies are signing up to that, not because of carbon leakage, but because they face an interest by investors across the world and so on. So I think and then we have technological possibilities that we as economists, already, are just starting to discover. The blockchain, the blockchain as a mechanism that could, contain information and make it secure so that we cannot, along the value-added chain, falsify entries and so on. So I think in the year that we still have, or maybe we have more than a year, let's be a little bit ambitious and get some, think about a system that is innovative and goes as far as possible in getting incentives right. I think this is very important. What I hear from the lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, but of course we have conversations with lawyers, is that indeed if we do it right, it is probably WTO consistent. We just have to be careful, but it's feasible. And the idea of extending the ETS to imports has also EU law advantages. I see them. And that's again the thing that I would favor. If we can't do that, then the Oberkum tax system would be the third best. Still better than doing nothing. Herr von Unger, how to give industry certainty about the costs they're facing. I think the carbon trade or indirect carbon trade, exports or imports, is only a small part of the cost uncertainty that they face. I mean, the problem, I think, of many CO2 intensive firms is about the carbon price in Europe. Will it be high? Will it be low? A lot of industries don't believe that the carbon price will be high. If you look at the stock market evaluations of Total, for example, obviously investors think that carbon prices will remain low, right? So I think it will be important for policymakers in Europe to be credible and to put a price path out there. Maybe the ideas Jean-Claude Trichet has been talking, or has, I had a conversation with him where I liked the idea of having some sort of a carbon central bank that makes sure, like inflation targets the price level, the central bank makes sure that we implement a price path so that industry can plan. I think talked already about Nicholas' point a little bit, and compensation, that was your point, how to incentivize the owners of fossil fuels to keep the stuff in the ground. Well, yes, compensation would be, we could simply bribe them, no, and say, okay, sell us your gas field or your coal mine. No, we buy the coal mine and we put it out of order. No, that's something we could do. It's maybe cheaper than doing some of the policies that, for example, Germany is now engaged in the climate package. There are other ways of dealing with the owners of fossil fuels. When you extract coal and you sell it to the world markets, you receive dollars or euros. What do you do with that? You invest it in the United States stock market or in Europe or something. And we could, with source taxation of the dividends, we could make those investments non-attractive, because what the fossil fuel owners do is they ask themselves what's better, extract the stuff or let it in the ground. If they extract it, they would invest it, and we could tax the investment proceeds. So there are many things we could do to help them or to convince them keep the stuff in the ground maybe a little bit longer.
Georg.
Yeah, maybe on the on this question of that there are production processes that are quite different for the same product. I mean, we have in carbon-intensive product, it's massive. I mean, we can produce steel essentially now with the first pilot projects with almost without emitting CO2, and we can produce steel in old open ovens with huge amounts of CO2 production, and there's a lot of possibilities in between. And the same for electricity, where you get a completely homogeneous product. So you get exactly the same product, kilowatt hours, and it's either coming from a wind turbine or from a lignite fire power plant. And I see it extremely difficult to kind of track that down through the value chain to see where something comes from. It's a lot of discretionary decisions. Do we take the average emission factor of the electricity system of China? Do we take the wind turbine that belongs to the steel manufacturer that is exactly appropriate for his export of steel, or do we take the marginal unit in China, which always is a coal-fired power plant, which they kind of have to switch on in order to run the steamer? And these questions will have to be settled. And the second point then is, I would see significant windfall profits. I mean, you have some countries that have, by historic coincidence, because they have a lot of hydropower in their country, or because they have historically a lot of nuclear, they are able to produce low carbon things, and that will then benefit. But is it that in the bigger picture, where Europe is only 10% of the consumption, will we make a marginal benefit, kind of addition by giving this incentive, or will essentially all this just fall as windfall profits on some of the producers? So we see trade deviations within the system, but marginally nothing happens, because there's no additional incentive to build something, to do something green. On the free allowances question, I would argue, you argued that WTO is essentially has never challenged them. Maybe they might, because free allowances are, in my view, not so clear. I mean, we have had free allowances handed out in Europe massively in a time of overproduction or overcapacities in many sectors, and they help to keep these industries in Europe despite global overcapacities. So there is a competitive element here. And if you argue that WTO does not allow to differentiate by the origin, which is clear, obviously it makes it much more difficult to design a policy that targets those countries on which we have leverage, say Ukraine, Morocco, and not target those countries which we fear, like the US, in a way. On the BDI question, I take example from the renewables policy. Even so, as I said, it has not been perfectly well designed. But as soon as we had a European policy on that, then DG Comp had to accept that there are European targets and member states are allowed to conduct policies in this area, and then state aid wasn't such a big of an issue, and WTO has contested some of the feed-in tariff systems, but mainly for local content provision issues and things like that. But you can seemingly design feed-in tariff systems or equivalents that are better designed in a way that is compliant with state aid rules. Yeah, I'll keep it at that.
Thanks. Is there any other question? Any other comments? No. Okay. So I think we can close the discussion. I think it's been a very rich discussion. I don't know whether it has been a conclusive discussion, but there is no need to be conclusive.
Not yet.
At this time, as I said, it's a start of a process. It's clear that there are lots of different facets, both domestically and internationally. And I think that's why it's indeed important that the Commission does a good job at consulting all the relevant parties, both within our borders, within the EU and outside. So it's clear that no country so far has implemented, at least at the national level, has implemented such a system.
California has one, no?
That's right. No, I said no country.
Yes.
So there are so California. There's a little bit in Canada as well. So within certain federations, there's been, but it cannot be compared at all. But no country. So at the federal level, no country has done it. There are more and more countries, and you talked about the US, you talked about China, and indeed China that does have sometime at the city level, sometime at the regional level, does have carbon pricing. In principle, they will be this year, 2020, a national framework. There is also in Canada a national, a federal framework, although there are some legal issues, in particular with Alberta. Alberta, which is the energy intensive state, is not liking some of those issues, understandably. So there are issues, but things are moving. But it is a fact that so far we don't have the experience of a country, either small or large, that has accompanied its domestic carbon pricing with an adjustment mechanism. So I suppose that means that, even though everybody knows that there is an issue, there are pros and cons, and so we shall see what the EU will decide. We are not in the same world that we were before. I mean, lots of things have changed. I think it will be a question that will remain alive and important in the coming months. So I think all of us will continue to contribute to this debate, and I'm very grateful to both of you. Thank you, Georg, for your interesting presentation and your paper, and Gabriel, thank you also for all you brought to the discussion.
Thank you, André.
Thank you.